Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Colangelo. I'm president of Consumers Research. Thank you all again for coming today. It was a really solid turnout and an amazing speaker list. We probably are on the cusp of this third wave, and I think that we've seen a lot of people estimating. I'm reminded of the visions of future from Arthur C. Clarke. He said in 1946 that man would put someone on the moon, and it was the boldest prediction that anyone had ever made, and people kind of thought he was a loony person, but he was so involved in rocket science that he saw the path forward for it. And so, nobody else in the world predicted in that year, 1946, that somebody would be going to, it was before World War II, so it must have been 37. But he said, we are going to put a man on the moon in 1989. And it was an insanely bold prediction. And of course, what happened was that history caught up with him and went so much faster that he was actually late by 20 years, right? So somebody making a prediction in 1967, would have nailed that date in 1969 better than him. So, we have to zoom out, I guess is the lesson there, and we have to realize that we are involved in this so much that it's easy for us to say, these things are decades away. They may not be. They may be months away. We have Brian Hoffman, by way of introduction here, the founder of OB1. We've talked about Open Bazaar. I don't know if we've talked about how revolutionary it is in that when you're interacting, it's a system to interact with people without trusting them, without knowing them, without meeting them, and without trusting an intermediary. A little bit of background on Brian: computer science from James Madison University, cybersecurity work with DoD and Booz Allen Hamilton. So I'm an alumnus of them too. So good company. Project maintainer for OB1. So project maintainer. We're going to get into what's the difference between a project maintainer and a CEO or an owner. He's raised $1 million from Union Square Ventures and others. Mira Yadav is the IBM Chief Data Officer for Blockchain Technologies. That's at IBM. So before that, she was the CTO for the middleware group at IBM, where she led the Emerging Technology Institute Lab. Today, she works with experiments all over the blockchain space, with touching on data and validated learning. Looking forward to learning what that is. Adjunct Professor of Electrical Engineering at NC State University. Wow, this is very impressive. York Rhodes, who earned his Bachelor's in Science and Computer Science from NYU. He's worked in technology. I'm just gonna say, York, I've heard his extended bio, and wherever the technology has kind of made a great leap forward, he's just happened to be in a very pivotal spot. So I think we might be able to thank him for all the innovations that we enjoy today. Everything from the internet to the first, he was there in Microsoft over 20 years ago. So he's really got an amazing perspective, and the fact that he's now in blockchain, really fascinated and captivated by this stuff, I think is a good sign for everybody at this conference. And he also worked Microsoft, IBM, software, Goldman Sachs, building the wireless internet, to advising bankers on wireless and future media. He's now on a second tour at Microsoft, despite saying that he never imagined he would be coming back. And he's an adjunct professor at NYU in the Masters of Integrated Marketing and Leadership programs. And so, we are on the cusp of something, and the speed of those things approaching, that's anybody's guess. So we probably won't be able to find anybody who's going to make a perfect prediction, but maybe through all of their different perspectives, we'll be able to get some good perspective of our own. So with that said, I'm going to ask my first question from here so then I can get mic'd up while you're talking. All right. So I'd like for you to each take a few minutes, tell us your vision of the future of blockchain technologies, and then your company's vision, and then how those two overlap. What is your company doing to enact your vision, and where do you see that future? Thanks.
Do you want to go?
You want me to start? Okay. Okay, those are some big questions. So I guess this starts with my background and how I got into Bitcoin to begin with, which is that I spent over 10 years in identity and access management consulting, shifting on into encrypted health messaging. using public key infrastructure for protecting patient data. And as I was working with government agencies and other commercial companies, helping them do these infrastructures and implementing them, when I saw Bitcoin was able to do a lot of the same things without any kind of intermediary, right? The peers were actually the self-enforcing participants of the infrastructure. It was extremely fascinating, and I could see a future where it wasn't these large, big Facebooks and Googles that ran the world, that maybe someday we got to the point where everybody on the planet could participate in the network equally and also be incentivized to participate. Seeing things like what miners are doing, earning Bitcoins for securing the network and things like that. So I spent several years just kind of researching and studying that, wondering where that was going, which inevitably leads down the road of trying to speculate on cryptocurrencies, which then immediately results in losing a lot of money. And then I like to think of that's really when you've become christened in the cryptocurrency space, right? Is when you've been scammed or you've lost money, you're here. So that happened, and then I just started seeking ways to get more involved and participate. OpenBazaar was just really a side project, but one thing was very obvious when I was trying to start OpenBazaar was that Bitcoin was this great technology, but there weren't a lot of really solid use cases quite yet. One of which I mentioned earlier, which I know a lot of people cringe whenever I bring it up, which is the Silk Road, but it really was this ability to show that digital currency could be used to create a marketplace, a free and open marketplace, which is something that really doesn't exist right now. When you look at like an Amazon or an eBay, they don't operate in all countries. They don't. They have strict regulations and rules about how you operate on the network, and they charge exorbitant fees to participate. So the future for me, from our perspective, is that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general enable a free and open marketplace. Free and open trade across the entire internet, and because a lot of the costs that are incurred to operate the network are at like the miners and at that level, the participants, like the buyers and sellers, can enjoy very low cost transactions, at least for now, to participate in that marketplace. So that's I don't think that's like a somewhat very singular view of where it's going, but for us, that's our focus right now.
So my story with blockchain is interesting. I was leading the emerging tech lab, and blockchain was one of the technologies we started playing around with almost 2 years ago. And I didn't really fall in love with it because I couldn't wrap my head around how it could impact the world. And then one day I was shopping in Whole Foods and I saw an apple that says locally grown. And I found myself leaning more towards buying things that were locally grown, or buying things that I knew their story of. And supply chains are completely dark. We don't know where we bought our shirt from, who made it, who grew the cotton, right? That got me really interested. And then I thought about it and said, maybe with blockchain, and it's possible with blockchain, we can make this process transparent. And then, as we started looking more at how this could really transform businesses, I started to fall in love with it and started working on it. It grew from a small project to something bigger. We had researchers across IBM working on core technology. They were working on consensus algorithms. They were working on cryptographic technologies, working on Blu-ray encryption. So really smart people, and we brought all these people together. And then, it became, I became a part of IBM's vision. So we at IBM are looking across the stack for blockchain technologies. We see the potential that it has to completely reinvent how businesses interact. We are part of the Hyperledger project with the Linux Foundation, so where we are building a permissioned blockchain, which uses, practical Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus mechanism. We have cloud offerings on top of that. We have, as the chief data officer, I see every single bit of data that flows through IBM on blockchain And I cannot tell you, it's very humbling to see how overwhelming the response has been from the industry. People are interested, the future will come, but I think the future is closer than we anticipated. Little bits of future we can see now. So we're doing tremendous amount of work with industry in whether it's tracking high value assets like diamonds, whether it's working with stock exchanges or Internet of Things. So there's just a tremendous amount of interest and tremendous amount of work going on in this field.
That's great, thank you. So thank you for the kind introduction. By the way, I did not invest in Bitcoin when it was $10 a share, so don't follow everything I do.
It's the perfect altruist. You left more for the rest of us.
But I have had actually an opportunity to observe and reflect, and 2020 hindsight is actually really good, so it creates great stories. But I kind of spent about 8 years riding different technology waves through my careers, I guess to some extent at the right time. Sometimes way too early, as I was describing to someone earlier today, that the Google Fiber project with Wi-Fi is something that I was doing in 2007 before the capital crunch of 2008. So timing's not always perfect. But I spent about 8 years in wireless in the 2000s before moving into e-commerce and really sort of getting steeped in how do we actually trust the internet as a vehicle for commerce beyond B2B things that we've been doing forever, like with EDI and things like that. So as I started to teach e-commerce, Bitcoin was a part of the curriculum, so I got a little bit of exposure to how do we talk about Bitcoin in a commerce perspective. But as a technologist, it never really interested me. And that's kind of where my passion is. That's something you learn after many years of banging your head against the wall, like where's your passion? And it's kind of important. So my passion drove me here. And I was not fortunate enough in 1993 to recognize that the internet was this amazing thing. I kind of feel like this is the 1993 of the next wave. So I feel very fortunate to actually had that revelation. And I think from an enterprise perspective, and I don't know if you see this from IBM, but I think I heard this in your conversation a little bit. A lot of folks in enterprise, and you have to imagine what a company like IBM or Microsoft is like, they're very conservative organizations, right? So, like, how do you, decide that you want to go invest in this interesting new technology? Typically, it is people pushing the envelope inside the enterprise and saying, "Hey, this," shaking the trees and saying, "This is interesting. We need to get people listening to this." And I often caution some of my colleagues who are extremely enthusiastic and extremely passionate that you got to tone it down a little because you're scaring people. Because people need to take a certain measured cadence about how they go about understanding what the opportunity is. And I agree. I mean, anything you read in the space is that this is a $500 billion opportunity across industries. So it is something that I've already told my management that I'm going to spend the next 8 years of my career on, and they can find a role for me to do that, or I can go do it somewhere else. So that's where my perspective is. My goal, therefore, is to make sure that the organization catches up to that vision. And so that's what I've been spending my second job doing for the last 6 months, which is basically working with our strategy team to look across the organization at all the different types of assets that we have. How do we look at it from a partner perspective? How do we look at it from a technology perspective? How do we look at it from an enterprise customer perspective and a deployment perspective? And every single verb and noun that we've talked about today, including permissioned and public, are things that we're talking about on a regular basis. So we actually did publish a white paper called Project Bletchley a couple months ago. And this basically, the way I describe it is that it's a framework that extends the trust envelope off of the blockchain to other systems. If you look at almost any enterprise, they are steeped in legacy systems. So in order for us to actually realize the value of blockchain in those enterprises, we have to do a good job connecting legacy systems into blockchain and extending the value of blockchain into legacy systems. So that's really the special sauce that's in Bletchley. If you read I think it's a 25-page white paper, maybe shorter, but about the first 75% of it is, for anyone in the Bitcoin or blockchain space is, basically skip that and look at the last 25%, which talks about, this idea of extending the trust envelope through something we call cryptlets and being able to run on an attested host. And you can think of this as basically a secure way to do an oracle, essentially. So that is sort of what we've been public about. What I like to talk about is any company like an IBM, a Microsoft, or other large enterprise will look at their assets and say, what can we do with those assets? And how can we help those assets drive our core strategy as a business? And Microsoft has a number of products in the market, from stuff that you see on your desktop to stuff that you see in the cloud. And our business has been pivoting probably for about 12 years to a cloud-based services business, which means that things like Office 365 run in the cloud, Dynamics 365 runs in the cloud. So there's a certain, what I would say, sort of an ease of value proposition for a company like Microsoft, which is we are providing phenomenal plumbing for both open source as well as non-open source commercial large ISVs and small startups to run successfully and create an environment that, like with Hyperledger, for example, allows you to quickly stand up something in the Azure cloud, including Hyperledger. In fact, if you look at the Project Bletchley white paper, the architecture diagram actually has Hyperledger on it. So we are an open cloud for any stacks, basically, to run in a cloud, and very focused on that. I also was fortunate to speak at the UN a couple months ago to talk about using blockchain-based identity to look at humanitarian issues worldwide. I think that identity is a really, really important opportunity in blockchain. Quite fortunately, Microsoft has some assets in that space as well. We have something called Active Directory. There's about 500 million registered Active Directory names across the enterprises. So that's an asset, going back to what I said before, that's an asset we want to look at. How do we take blockchain identity, connect it up with Active Directory, create a value proposition for both the enterprise as well as the consumer around identity? So there's a ton of assets. I mean, I could go on and on and on. LinkedIn, I was mentioning earlier, is another interesting sort of consumer-oriented application. Joe's looking at his watch.
I'm looking at my watch.
But you touched on a very good point. He says, IBM and Microsoft are traditional enterprises, and they take time to wake up to a new technology. We started with 2 people on the project in my team. I grew, and we are more than 150 right now. We quickly ramped up, and so that just shows that we do have belief that this is going to be a successful technology, and we have our senior leadership investing heavily in us.
And not only that, but from the regulatory space to the legislative world to large companies, Bitcoin and blockchain has this way of self-selecting people who are kind of passionate, open-minded, enthusiastic already. So that's just an observation that I've made over the last 2 years, is that when I'm talking to a regulator, they say, listen, I understand that from your perspective, I'm the person wearing the suit who works in this government office, but you have to understand that from the perspective of my peers and my bosses, and this might be the same at IBM and Microsoft, like I'm the nutty person who raised my hand when they said who wants to do Bitcoin blockchain stuff. So we have a self-selection thing, and I think it's going to serve the community really well in the long run. So thank you both for self-selecting yourselves to help carry this burden.
And and you're never too early. I worked at Booz Allen, and at the time, a couple of years ago, they did not do any Bitcoin stuff, and everybody thought it was the nut. But there was somebody here speaking as a blockchain person, so it tells you how things change quickly.
Exactly. So with all of the projects you're using, and Brian, I am going to include you in this one. Even though the answer to you, Brian, might be obvious, I think it's helpful to hear, why use blockchains rather than a very advanced, network database?
Well, from our perspective, I mean, we use Bitcoin primarily as a currency. within OpenBazaar. We don't really use the network as like a data storage layer, which there are kind of two positions I think on that is the blockchain certainly serves to allow you to put immutable data into the ledger that can't be changed, but at the same time it's not really a true database per se, right? Like you don't want to cram in silly stuff into the ledger. So what we do is we basically use it for currency's sake, and we have a separate kind of peer-to-peer network that using IPFS, if you've ever heard of that, which is very similar to BitTorrent for the data transmission part. I forgot the question.
You answered it. You did fine.
Okay.
You did it. Yeah.
Did I do it?
Yep.
Okay.
Good job.
Okay. From
I literally did.
No, you
Sorry.
did a good job.
Sorry.
You cannot use a database.
Central databases are very good at what they're supposed to do. They're central databases. They store data with a central authority that gives you access. The things that central databases do not do is they do not bring trust, transparency, and truth to the system. How many of us have bought a car or bought a diamond and not known whether it was a blood diamond or not, or bought an apple or bought a shirt that we don't know where it was sourced from? Databases have existed, but they haven't solved that inherent problem that we needed to solve to bring more transparency into our system. The way blockchain technology works is it's a chained set of transactions that are stored. The four of us could have our own copy of the ledger. Everything is encrypted and chained together, so nobody can take out a transaction. If they tried, it would leave an auditable record, and each one of us have our own copy, right? So it's inherently different from a central shared database. So that's the reason the features like transparency, auditability, immutability that empower a blockchain to solve these new sets of business interactions that we've never seen solved before.
I'm going to let York say, but we're going to revisit immutability in a minute. Okay, thank you.
So it's an evolution of technology. I think if you look at databases is a good example. If you look at databases and say, well, why can't we just do what we're doing with blockchain with databases today? That's a good question. Like, why haven't we done that, right? Why haven't we had databases that are multi-party, transactional, permissioned, or trustless type of systems on the internet today? It's because it's hard, right? So this is an evolution of technology, just like when Facebook and Twitter started creating streams of data on the internet. SQL Server didn't work for that, right? So they came up with new databases. So we saw this huge evolution of database technologies in the last 10 years to things that most people who were doing databases in the prior decade would have no idea even what mango, apricot, or avocado were, right? I mean, there's all these different flavors of databases now, right? They're new technologies for purpose. So we've had, fortunately, some really smart people bring together things that have been possible for 20 years in unique and new ways to create this thing called blockchain that has really interesting characteristics. Now, taking that sort of one step further to the enterprise point that I made earlier, which is, how do I integrate with an existing enterprise system that might have, millions of transactions or hundreds of thousands of transactions per second? You're going to have to think about how do you architect that and how do you work from a blockchain context into an existing enterprise transaction-based system and make it scale, because scalability today is one of the key challenges with any kind of blockchain variant in terms of technology. So, one recent project that we're working on, for example, we had fairly sophisticated architecture. It's a permission system because it was basically a consortium type of network. So everyone on the network would have a permission and be allowed into the network essentially. So it's not on a public network. Transaction volume is extremely high. Lots of tertiary multi-party relationships. So part of this architecture is a Kafka stream database, right? So it's a way that we can actually capture a lot of the transactions, make sure that they don't fall off the wire before getting them appropriately onto the chain. So there will be very hybrid type of deployments when we look at enterprise in particular. And the example that you used effectively is essentially a hybrid as well, right? You're leveraging IPFS for distributed storage. You could have used anything else, right? That would have allowed you to do payment plus, right?
Yeah, I think
two more questions,
just to add something to that, I think you guys make a good point about enterprise. Generally one of the good things about enterprise is you guys know how to scale. They have to support big businesses, and I think Bitcoin is obviously going through some interesting challenges around scaling. And how do we get there? And I think there's a weird overlap where we're still, Bitcoin in general is still kind of at this early database stage, and enterprise is already well, we know how to scale that. Let's just do it. So we're seeing all these private ledgers and all these other things because it's well, we can do all this scaling stuff. Let's just do it now. Let's just do it now. And so I think over the next few years, we're going to see this weird merging of all that knowledge from databases starting to kind of seep into blockchains, and we're going to really see what is blockchain. What blockchain is today is probably going to look a lot different really, really quickly.
When we first put out our service, we got an overwhelming need for people wanting to create their networks. We would limit our capacity to 500, but we would wake up at midnight to increase our capacity again. Right now we have 6,000 networks spun up, and the system went down. And the biggest hurdle was bringing 6,000 networks back up at the same time. That was our biggest problem, but we figured it out fairly quickly. But it was very interesting to see how quickly the demand went, how quickly we needed to scale up.
Do you think it's zero sum at all between those two enterprises, Bitcoin scaling and enterprise scaling? Do you think that if Bitcoin's too slow, that it will, enterprises will move in and take over its future? Or do you think that the two can coexist and grow together? With
technology, a lot of the legacy technologies are not perfect and they stick around, right? Look at SMTP, mail. It's not very secure at all, but because of the traction it got, it's still around. And so, Bitcoin may be one of those technologies where it's the incumbent and it just hangs around forever and it's very stable and safe. And I think that's why it's great that we have things like Ethereum and all these other things popping up, because the people that are not patient enough to wait for these things to kind of evolve are going and innovating, and those things can kind of get ported back into Bitcoin. So I don't know. Maybe you guys have a different perspective on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a zero-sum game at all. I think that there are things that you can do. If you take it from a consultancy perspective, what is the core competency of any consultant? It's to work around bottlenecks, right? Whether it's database optimization, network throughput, scalability of processing power for a specific task. That's what consultants do all day long, right? So you look at the technology at hand, somebody says, build this with Bitcoin plus whatever. Your job is to go build that, right? It's a different question if somebody says, I want to re-architect my business, tell me how to do it, right? Those are two different questions. Very often, consultants are brought in to say, okay, we tried to do this and we really want to do it with blockchain, but we're having trouble, so help us, right? So by definition, they've already given you the problem space, right? But anybody who becomes an expert at something, like all of the folks in the cryptocurrency space who are steeped in cryptography and are experts at Bitcoin, they're thinking about that space, right? And that's the constraints within which they work. When you start to open up the problem space and open up the possible solutions and think more broadly, then you can do all kinds of interesting hybrids.
I have one more question, but if you have a question for the panel, please line up so we can go right into questions. What have any of the recent developments with Ethereum, the DAO, the fork, Ethereum Classic? Apparently today there is Classic Ethereum, which is not Ethereum Classic, which is Classic Ethereum, launched this morning. Has any of this given you pause for your relationship, or made you reconsider using the Ethereum protocol at Microsoft or IBM to the extent that you've engaged with it?
So two things. One, Bitcoin Classic, Ethereum Classic, Ripple, Dash, Steem, and there's hundreds of virtual currencies, right? And there's hundreds of stacks, right? So the question and where we are in the evolution of this industry is trying things out, right? We're very close to everything was an academic white paper, and now we're kind of like, the white papers are now actually developed, right? So now we're testing, scalability of the white papers. Frankly, from my perspective, I think it's a good thing, right? Diversity of thought, to your point, right, is actually really, really good for this industry. There's probably still some Bitcoin maximalists in the room that wouldn't agree with me, but
Hands in the air if you're a Bitcoin maximalist.
Well, I think that there's a difference between using one of these blockchains for practical business purposes today and experimenting and doing innovative things. For OpenBazaar, we're not looking to build something for 10 years from now. We're like, we want this thing to work now. And so we've decided to stick with Bitcoin because that's the one that we really trust and know that there's a good amount of security behind. And we trust the core developers to protect that. At least we've seen that for the last so many years.
And we shouldn't forget that blockchain was a gift to the world from Bitcoin community. So, so there's, it brings innovation for sure, but, it didn't affect us at IBM because at IBM we built a permissioned blockchain. We needed to have pluggable consensus. Our customers needed high transaction rates. So we wanted something that didn't have proof of work or proof of stake so that it wouldn't slow us down. So it didn't really affect us.
Are there any questions from the audience?
So, Mika, one thing with blockchain is, of course, decentralization of the computing and whatever the functional things are. But when you said breaking up or kind of scaling from 500 to 6,000,
So it wasn't 6,000 nodes. It was 6,000 networks. So our first developer offering that we put out was a 2-peer, 1 certificate authority network, which we've now upgraded to 4-peer, 1 certificate authority network. It was a free developer offering that we had, and we had 7,000 instances of those networks. So just that simple scalability problem. We had to work around that, and it's really we wanted to make it so simple that you come and click a button and you can deploy your network and start writing chain code. So we were able to do that. Yeah.
So when you're building your own cloud, like you're saying, IBM is coming up with their own cloud. What is the status? That means they're providing the compute resources?
So we have a cloud offering out already. One is for a developer plan, and one is our high security limited beta that we've put out. And the idea behind that is you can spin up the Hyperledger Fabric code that we are working on in the open in a matter of seconds in the cloud and start using it. Right. So it'll spin up. So when you click a button, it'll spin up a 4-peer, 1 certificate authority network for you.
Yeah. So my question was, so if enterprises come to IBM and then start spinning up their, all their compute, whatever is required in the cloud, doesn't that become, kind of one place to go, not like a decentralized place where we are envisioning, I'm coming here with my compute.
So the idea behind this, they create a network, but you can have, the nodes will have different ownerships. What we're also working on is dynamic addition of a node. So a company can have a node and then dynamically join a network, right? So that's one of the offerings that's going to come out in the future, but we're working towards that. So the goal ultimately is, if I invite 1,000 people to my network, 1,000 people have their nodes and they have a complete ownership of their nodes, and we're able to quickly and easily build that. This is just I was just telling you about our current offering that's out there in the cloud.
Next question, sir.
Yes, thank you. Hello?
Is there a button to turn it on?
it's on now.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's very informative, and it's a variety of perspectives, so really appreciate it. A couple quick questions on Hyperledger. Are we confident that Hyperledger will achieve network effects similar to maybe a public blockchain like Bitcoin, or is that even an important consideration at all? And then number two, I'm very curious on the underlying architecture. Is Hyperledger going to interoperate with the public blockchain such as Bitcoin in order to update itself perhaps on a certain time period? Is there any consideration as far as interoperability or need for interoperability? Thank you.
So so as the chief data officer, I'm often asked that question: what is our path against our competitors? And I said, we are a blip right now, but we are our traction is pretty good. Hyperledger currently has 56 members, 12 premium and 44 regular. So that's that shows promise that it's going well. We have to remember we just came out in February, last December and then February. So we're a little baby compared to some of the other projects. So we have to give it time. I do think with the different communities coming together to Hyperledger, it shows promise, and we will get there. To your second question around the architecture of Hyperledger
Yes.
and being able to communicate with other chains, it's something that's been on our radar, for different chains to work together. Now, my background is a chip designer, so don't ask me to explain this anymore, but when you get two chains to commit together, you get into something called a two-phase commit problem, right? Which is a hard computer science problem to solve. We are working on it. We are not there yet. Our goal is to allow chains to communicate. We haven't solved that problem 100% just yet.
Outstanding. Thank you.
And I think you also have a lot of companies looking at interledger protocols that effectively solve that problem.
Yep.
I thought I heard sort of a different question as well, which was almost like a DevOps question, which is, if you're running a private chain, how do you keep it up to date?
Yes, actually, that was part of the question, and may you answer that part too?
I mean, I think that's basically, if you think about DevOps, right, you're going to put a process in place that ensures that a code base stays up to date based on some kind of heuristics. That's not a hard problem to solve at all.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I know Microsoft is working with Consensus to provide a blockchain as a service. I'm assuming you guys are working with your enterprise customers to build applications. What are some applications you guys are seeing enterprise companies being interested in?
So, so we have Consensus, which is a consulting company actually headquartered in Brooklyn, was the first partner that we brought into blockchain as a service. We do credit them for a lot of their momentum. We have 40 partners approximately that are working on our stack. And so today they're at various stages of maturity, and they can be all kinds of variants of different products. From an enterprise perspective, which I think what the question was, we're getting pull from both large enterprises and large partners to help with either internal problems or consumer or customer-facing business problems. And so one of the partners, for example, is a API provider in the healthcare space. They have about 400 partner organizations that they connect to. They run about tens of millions of transactions per day, I think. There's about 4,000 third-party applications built on top of their API, and what they've been actually had a vision for about 5 years is that blockchain is an important part of, I'll call it decentralization of healthcare, but really it's about consumer record ownership in the healthcare space, which solves for a lot of the tertiary problems that we were talking about earlier in terms of getting your data to the appropriate person. And that's a very simple thing, by the way. Just call up your doctor and say, I want to send my records to another doctor so I can visit them on the weekend. That's a hard problem, right? And
Took me 1 week to get my son's records transferred.
Yeah, this is something that
I had to physically drive to the doctor's office and get them.
Right. So, consumer-owned healthcare data actually through blockchain identity is actually something that's really interesting and really important. There are a lot of other examples across industries, whether it's utility, public sector, like Tori was talking about earlier, where people are spinning up solutions. I would say that I think a lot of the talk earlier this year in 2016 was that this is the year of the proof of concept. There are some production deployments that are happening this year. I wouldn't say they're massive scale production deployments. Next year, I think, is a more likely time for larger scale.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and get ready. Things are going to get real meta soon with app coins, which is kind of like the new thing, I think, that a lot of companies are going to be doing. So if you're not up on all your altcoins, get ready for app coins. They're coming.
Pokemon coin will probably be the #1 market cap coin in the first day it's released.
Why didn't they do that already?
Mita, York, Brian, thank you so much for a terrific panel. I appreciate all of your insight, and let's give them a round of applause. Thanks.